joining us. This is going to be a fun series once again with
It was fun
Professor
researching and
Clementi.
preparing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yes, he actually does have a holiday shirt on. Is there any significance to the fact it's holiday? Does it say Norway on there, Doug? So the fact that I have to go into Norse and Viking, mythology, is there a connection?
Hey, Doug.
That and the keyboard player is pretty short, so I suspect he might be a dwarf.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Good to see you, Ellen.
Hi, Al.
Ellen's another one who's a good Tolkien fan. So I'm actually going to be drawing over some of the things you guys have actually told me over the years, where some of those pieces of literature have affected you. Yeah. How you doing, Mom? You ready for a non-historical lecture that's actually historical?
Yes.
No. So Miss Otteson, this is my mommy.
Hello.
Ellen Clemente. And she doesn't really like anything that has to do with literature or mythology or anything. But we're going to be bringing in quite a bit of history with it too. And remember, Mom, just to keep it in mind, when you study literature, you study mythology and whatnot, you are taking a glimpse into the people who've accessed it and wrote it. That's what you're getting from. That's the value of the book.
Alex, this is your mother. Aren't you going to introduce us?
Yes.
Yes, this is.
I've never met this woman before.
This is Helen Clemente.
Hello, Douglas.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Hi, Ellen and Samantha.
Hello.
Eileen
Doug,
and
you
Heather.
well, I was here.
Charlotte. Who else is here?
You'll know that Charlotte, you could also tell Charlotte
Jasmine and
afterward
Andrew are on too.
how your son was not the best student in his younger years. And the time she's had to do reports for me in the middle of the night.
And they were the literature report.
He was in the literature ones. Yes. All right, well, it is 7 o'clock. I'll turn things over to Heather since you are administrator.
Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us for the cultural history of dwarves with Alex Clementi. And this will be one in a series of 3 cultural histories of, I guess you would call them peoples.
Fantasy races. If you want to
Yes,
put it that way.
yes. And we're looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Heather. We appreciate that. And so thank you all for being here. Absolutely. I'm glad to, those who are interested in the topic.
Aren't you paying us?
Yes, I have. That's true. I've slipped some of you cash. We won't say which ones, but I think it's obvious. So just as a quick introduction, what I'd like to say is that the title of this, as was just mentioned, is a brief cultural history of dwarfs. Now, a couple things to think about. Number one, it is brief. There is a tremendous amount of things that could be said, and we have an hour. And now looking at, we have 59 minutes. So it's possible there's some aspects of tonight's material that you would really like, and we seem to glance over it. And my apologies in advance for the fact that we're just looking at this as an overview. The second thing to remember, or to note, is it is a brief cultural history of dwarfs, or is it dwarves? What's with the spelling change? We'll address the spelling change as well. Why some spell it with a V and some spell it with an F. So I'd like to ask for a little audience participation in the beginning. I'm just going to take out a pencil and jot down any of your impressions. Some of you I've asked this privately. When you think of a dwarf, in whatever, however you've engaged with dwarfs, through Tolkien or through, Grimm's fairy tales, or whatever it may be, what characteristics do you think of? Are there any adjectives or nouns that come to mind? I'm just curious. What do you have, Ma?
Little.
So little, so we're looking at stature. Others? Samantha?
Harry.
Hairy, lots of facial hair, beards, and so forth. Doug?
I was going to say bearded.
Yeah, it's such an important feature, isn't it? What about attitude? Any attitudes that you see in literature and so forth, or even in film? Miss Timon?
Grumpy.
Grumpy. Oh, they could be a little emotional. Anybody else?
Mischievous?
Could be mischievous. That's interesting. Very interesting. That's going to be noted at some point in today's lecture. Good one, Heather. Back to mom.
Curious dresser.
Say again.
Curious dresser.
Oh, the dress, and not just the groom, but the dress is very, very distinct. Samantha.
They're usually very closely connected to the earth.
Ooh, connection to earth. And probably we can add things like stubborn. That could be another one. Loyal, that sometimes comes through. How about hatred of elves, or like say disagreement with elves? That one comes up a lot, right? So I just wrote some of those things down that you mentioned, and we're going to see if any of that comes through, and importantly, where those concepts came from. Coming back into our discussion, I'd like to bring you just to our lecture outline for today to know our format. We're actually going to start not in a chronological way. I thought about doing it chronologically, but maybe we'll start in the middle. And by that, I mean we start with Middle Earth, looking at Tolkien. And did you notice the spelling with a V? Tolkien's Dwarves, which I unfortunately just messed up. There we go, Tolkien's Dwarves. It turns out that J.R.R. Tolkien, when speaking of dwarves and elves, spelled those fantasy races with V's because he felt, remember, he was a linguist mainly, not a writer, but a linguist. And he felt by giving them a V sound, it would make them sound more ancient and more dignified. So you're ever wondering why in some literature they're called dwarfs with an S, or F rather, or V. In this case, that's the reason why. So we'll talk about Tolkien and his writing, which no doubt influenced many of us here in the room. Also dwarfs, now we're back to the F again, of the Norse world. Now we go back to the beginning, from the Viking culture of Northern Europe. Where do you get actual concept of dwarves first? And then, even if some of us here in this room are not really well versed, I know my aunt and uncle hopefully will be here later. My uncle Richie loves Viking history. He's well versed in the Norse world. Though some of you here are well versed in Tolkien's writings, but for those of us that are not, the playing field will be completely leveled once we get to this section on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because we're all familiar with that. And I like to deem that the triple history of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Triple history, why? We'll get to that. And please understand, that will be a very large section of tonight's lecture in the second half of our discussion tonight. We'll look at some other dwarfs that are dwarves that appear in some of Grimm's fairy tales. If we're still unsure who the Grimm brothers were, I'll go over that. And we're going to end off on something a little fun, kind of a conundrum, a riddle, if you will. The question over Rumpelstiltskin. Was Rumpelstiltskin a dwarf? If not, come back next week. Was he an elf? If not, come back the week after that. Was he a goblin? Because that's the exact order that we're going through in the fantasy races.
What's a no?
Okay, so you had a thought on that, Aunt Dolores?
Huh?
Did you have a thought on that?
Oh, I didn't even know my mic was
Oh, okay,
on.
that's all right. I thought you were.
I don't know. I just always thought he was a dwarf. But then again, I'm saying
He's
to myself,
described as a little man. So getting back to the very first characteristic, Mom, you said little. So was Rumpelstiltskin a dwarf? That's just a little fun puzzle for us at the end that will also tie the three lectures together. All right, that said, let's get into our discussion. I'm going to go right back into some of these slides, and we're going to start with Tolkien, and I'm going to bring you back to 1937 in late September when the book The Hobbit was released, first introduced onto the world. Here is a scene painted by, and Doug, I know you're very familiar with the brothers Hildebrandt, who were very famous brothers back in the 1970s, 80s, and I think even sometime after that, known for doing a lot of fantasy art. Those brothers actually were involved with the original Star Wars poster. And back in the 70s, they came up with a calendar with all scenes from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as The Hobbit. And here's a scene there of Bilbo Baggins surrounded by, well, what looks like not 13 dwarves, but at least the majority of them, and a very scrunched up wizard named Gandalf here, who's trying to, stay in a very low roof. What do you see? Well, a lot of things that you described. You see the short stature. The beards, the hair, absolutely. The curious clothing that's mentioned. And in this scene, the reason why I picked this, it's a scene very early in the book where Tolkien tells you about these 13 dwarves who have this quest to go and reclaim their homeland. So they have a long memory, and when they are wronged, they don't forget it. And so in this scene, right out of the book, you'll see a song that they sing. And even Peter Jackson's movie adaptation of this takes directly from the book that particular song, a dirge, you will, of what they sing, missing their homeland that was taken over by an evil dragon, who we talked about for those that were here on a dragon lecture some months ago. Interestingly enough, when you look at these individuals, I will tell you the difference between them in the book and the Peter Jackson films, if you've seen the 3 films that he stretched this very short children's book out into, very long tail. There you see Peter Jackson giving each and every one of those dwarves a very distinctive look, a very distinctive personality, distinctive clothing, hair, headdress, hairstyle. And that's what we do in movies, I guess, is we want to be able to look at people as individuals. You don't see it that much in his book. Thorin, the main character, of the dwarves, who's soon to be king, or he should be king of the homeland he's trying to reclaim. He does a lot of speaking. Another dwarf named Balin, who's another primary speaker. Some of the other dwarves say things from time to time, but in general, they're kind of looked at as a collective for the most part. And the only distinguishing mark between them, if you know how the book opens up, is when they start coming in one by one, and they're described as having different colored hoods. So-and-so had a hood of, of this color and that color. Here's the names of those dwarves. This is going to be significant for our discussion tonight. Actually, the names will be significant, trust me. Thorin Oakenshield, who's their leader. He again was the one that should be king under the mountain stronghold of Erebor that they're going to try to reclaim. His nephews, Fili and Kili. Unfortunately, it's those 3 that become, sorry, I'm spoiling the book for you, but they're the 3 that end up dying. Okay, they're the only casualties out of the 13 of these dwarves. But you've got Dwalin and his brother Balin, Bliffer, Boffer, Bomber, Dori, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Glowin. Okay, very rhythmic kind of names and so forth. What you notice is that is very much a children's book. Bear that in mind. This is a children's book. It reads like a children's book. It's very whimsical, very comedic. You see the dwarves' personality throughout that we described. They got a temper. They've got courage. They're very much in the ground. I mean, after all, they're going to take a mountain stronghold, so it's inside a mountain in the ground. Remember, Samantha had said that earlier. Their closeness to the earth is involved. But what really is interesting is when you start reading further in Tolkien's works, when you go into the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Fellowship of the Ring, followed by the Two Towers, and then later on, the last of the 3, the Return of the King. Those 3, and feel free to chime in if I get stuck, because I know some of you guys are very versed in this. Those 3 books, you see more of the dwarven activity there, as well as something else I'm going to show you to give you a real appreciation for the extreme attention to detail on the part of J.R.R. Tolkien. And that's this. This is what you'd find in one of the appendices of the trilogy, an actual genealogy. Now, I understand the print is small. It's not clear, it's not really essential that we be able to read every single name, but just to show you that he established an actual genealogy of the different dwarven houses in his mythology. And remember, his mythology, Tolkien's mythology, was a monotheistic mythology, one God, because he himself was a very devout Catholic, very affected by Christianity, and he wanted to translate some of his faith into a mythology that incorporated some of English culture. And in doing so, he explained that it was actually one of the Valar, which will be discussed next week. It's a type of elf, if you might, that helps, type of angel, you might say, that went ahead of God. God is named Iluvatar in this mythology, and said, I know you're going to make this race pretty soon, meaning elves, but I really want to make dwarves. And he went and made this other race, and it didn't come out right. They came out too short and a little too close to the earth and so forth. And that's how the dwarves were created, kind of like without permission, but they were allowed to live. And Iluvatar just allowed them to sleep until the elves were made, and then he woke the dwarves up. So if you ever hear terms like elves and dwarves, see how connected they are? Elves and dwarves are part of the Eldar races, meaning the older races, older than humankind. That's what's being referred to. Some of you might be very familiar with the fact that the dwarves in Tolkien's mythology are referred to as Durin's folk. I'll repeat that again, Durin's folk. And here it's in this genealogy that you read about who their founding father was, a dwarf named Durin. And there were actually 6 Durins over time. Sometimes kings took on the name Durin. And from them, you ended up having the different houses that split off and throughout Middle-earth. So again, very, very detailed. Some of the characters that we've talked about already, like Balin and Dwalin, show up on this list. Here's Thror and his son Thrain and his son Thorin Oakenshield, a key factor name in The Hobbit, as well as some of these other characters that show up elsewhere. So again, we're looking at a very, very advanced look at dwarves, which really goes far beyond anything that was created about dwarves before this. And there were other tales about dwarves, obviously, before Tolkien. He did not invent them. He took from other types of literature, which we'll soon discuss, and formed this in his own mythology. But he's the one that really puts them into great detail, where other fantasy writers, video game writers, movie writers, writers of novels and so forth will go and expand on the concepts that we see in these works. Again, starting in 1937, when the Hobbit came into this, onto the world scene. I think I would be remiss, and you should fire me from this job, if I did not talk about the quintessential dwarf. Or again, is it dwarf? Okay. And once again, Doug, for your benefit, I know you like the brothers Hildebrandt. I'm drawing from their calendar, and you'll notice this very important set of friends. Would anybody like to comment who these 2 individuals are? I know some of you know who this would be.
Oh man, when you get old, the mind goes. But it's the 2 from the the dwarf and the elf who were friends, Legolas and Gimli.
Exactly. Very good. And I know, Doug, for you, that was a part of the book you said when you were growing up that really affected you. The friendship between these 2 individuals, because they came from races that didn't trust one another. Please bear in mind, this is heavily drawn from the personality of J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien fought in the First World War. Much of his work on The Hobbit, and more importantly, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, was shaped from his experiences in the trenches. This is a man, like many people, who came back from the war asking, why did I shoot at someone from my same faith? Catholics shot at Catholics, Protestants shot at Protestants, Lutherans shot at Lutherans. Why did this happen? And so in the book, you see something really beautiful. It's not the main storyline by any means, there's a much bigger picture going on in those books, as you know, but we're zooming in on the relationship between this quintessential dwarf Gimli, who you come to know and love so well, and this very rocky relationship he has with this other companion who's on the same quest, Legolas. And what happens over time, they begin to understand one another. They begin to know one another. And by the end of the story, the way they speak to each other is much different. In fact, going back to that genealogy, if we were to go all the way down and find Gimli there, we would notice that Gimli has a moniker after his name. He will be known as Gimli, elf friend. So the concept of breaking down the racism, breaking down the boundaries, because if you're standing for what's good, you should be united. And it comes through beautifully with these 2 characters. And I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we will look at this very same illustration next week, because we have to discuss the elves. which means Legolas will be a big part of our discussion. If you saw the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I know many of you have, you may have really enjoyed the portrayal by John Rhys Davies, who played Gimli and just did a spectacular job. I invite you, if you want to go on YouTube at some point and look at interviews with some of the other actors who played with him, the way he talked to the stuntmen, the way he got dressed for his role, he was always in that Gimli mindset and really embodied many of the things that you said. Yeah, he's small, but he's a good fighter, but he's tenacious, but he's stubborn, but he likes to drink and rabble rouse. But at the same time, he's loyal to his friends and he is tenacious against his enemies. It was a brilliant job of casting. This was already a very experienced actor and really, really well done. I know my friend Andrew, who's on with us right now, one of his absolute favorite scenes in the adaptation of the books, when you get the very first movie, hence from the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, is when the whole party, which includes Gandalf, of course, and the hobbits, and Gimli and Legolas the elf, Gimli the dwarf, and some other humans there too, when they enter this amazing place called Moria, called Khazad-dûm in the Dwarvish language, which would translate to dwarf manor or dwarf mansion. And it is this amazing underground city that the dwarves, as great craftsmen, have built, actually carving it out of the inside of the stone mountain. And Peter Jackson, as a director, does an amazing job. The reaction as they look and behold what has long been an abandoned city, but almost like the ruins, if you've ever got a chance, or if anyone's visited places like the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, and you saw what a lost civilization, or the Forum of the Romans, and you see this former civilization there. It's a really awe-inspiring scene. Well, just to tell you a little bit about that, I think it's important to talk about Khazad-dûm, because that great city was a city, if you go back into, and I know Samantha, you've read the Silmarillion. That's a book that not many people read who are Tolkien fans, but because it reads a little bit more almost biblical. It almost has like a biblical feel to it, In the 47th year of Iluvatar, this happened, But you get into the first dwarves, and you find out it is Durin, the founding dwarf, that actually founds that particular city. And he goes up to a lake, and he looks in the reflection of this lake, and he sees what looks like the reflection of a crown of 7 stars. And he takes that as a positive sign. This is where I'm going to build my city. And other dwarves will build on that city later. Well, if you know anything from that movie and the books, there is a gate that's on the western side of this great mountain city, underground city of Khazad-dûm. And the gate is actually carved into the stone. And you could see some of the reasons why this image, and by the way, if anyone's read the actual books, which I'm going to hold up for you right now, here's just a bound volume of all 3 books together. I can skim through, and there's going to be a picture that I just showed you right in there. It's a key picture that Tolkien drew for his readers to try to visualize that this is a door that has significance. You see a crown with 7 stars because of the vision that this founding father had. Here, the hammer and anvil, which is often seen in fantasy art and fantasy literature and other means to represent dwarves and their craftsmanship. It just so happens to be the family crest of Durin, and it shows up there. Now, if you're wondering about this star, if you're wondering about the trees, if you're wondering about these letters, or why many people who are first introduced to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and they come upon this, say, well, this is the gate to go into a dwarven city. Why did Tolkien specify that the writing on the outside of the door was in Elvish, not Dwarvish? Well, somebody may know the answer to that. If you don't know the answer, can I encourage you to come back next week? See the hook? See how I hooked you in? You come back next week because we're going to look at this very same door again, and we're going to understand why it was in Elvish. and what these other symbols mean. It's significant to the relationship between elves and dwarves. And so that's key. There's something else to consider too, you might find interesting, just going back, if I could, to the genealogy. There is a connection between what's written in that child's book, The Hobbit, and the much more adult book, you might say, adult meaning age-wise, of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There's connections. Gimli, for example, who is that dwarf who's in all three of those books, his father, Glóin, was one of the dwarves that accompanied Bilbo in The Hobbit. His cousins Balin and Dwalin were also there. So there's a connection there. And that connection was beautifully done, I thought, by Peter Jackson when he did an adaptation. Many fans get a little upset because he really stretched out that child's book into 3 movies and added a lot of stuff that wasn't there. I know, Samantha, you and I are kind of united on that. You're kind of getting a different story altogether, but he did draw on some connections, like when Glóin mentions his wee son, Gimli, and Legolas, who ends up in the movie, makes fun of how ugly he is. Okay, which wouldn't happen, but it kind of fits the motif. Anyway, so in short, dwarves, as we see them, you see it right in the mythology of Tolkien. They are hardy, they are strong, they are fighters, but they're great craftsmen. They live in the mountains, they live in mines. In fact, that's one of the lines that a lot of my friends quote when Gimli finally gets to see the lost city of Moria. He goes, and it's a mine. They call it a mine. He was so excited about that. You see this motif. Well, here's my question. Where did Tolkien get all of these concepts from? Some, of course, he invented, but it's not completely out of thin air, because the next part of our lecture has to consider something very, very important. We're going to be talking right now about what we see in Norse mythology. There's going to be a couple Norse examples of dwarves, or Viking examples of dwarves. I should tell you that the sources that we're taking from, and to my uncle who's just chimed in with us, he's just popped on. I know he loves, my Uncle Rich loves Viking history and Viking lore and so forth. There are 3 main sources that we would study to understand what the Vikings believed. And as a quick reference, when you're thinking of the Vikings and when the Vikings were around, as just a general rule of thumb, figure from 793 of our Common Era, or AD, to about the year 1066. Those are the centuries we consider the Viking Age. After that, there's no more Vikings. They've assimilated into other countries. They've all turned to Christianity. You know, you've got some that have now become French culture and English culture. But these 3 particular pieces of literature that we research today to understand what the Vikings may have believed actually were all written in the 1200s, the 13th century. I'll show you again that just a list of a couple of them and some excerpts. One is called the Prose Edda, Edda meaning saga. This is something that comes about the 1230s or so, 1220s, 1230s, we think. It is preceded by something known as the Poetic Edda. Again, a very loose conglomeration of different stories. And as some of you had the chance months and months ago to attend my lecture over Zoom about Norse mythology, you'll find it's not as straightforward as people would like it to be. I know we all would like Odin to be Odin and always be Odin, and we want Thor to be Thor and always act like Thor, and that's just not how the Vikings wrote. It was the stories are so ever changing, it's hard to find something consistent. But we go to these particular works just to get a glimpse, an idea, what the Norse, or meaning the Vikings, had believed. It was an Icelandic historian by the name of Snorri Sturluson. Snorri Sturluson had put together most of what's in the Prose Edda. And in that, you come across one tale of a dwarf named Brok. And notice he is a craftsman. So the Vikings had that concept that the dwarves were very good craftsmen. And why were they good craftsmen? Because, as Samantha had mentioned earlier, you associate them with the ground, with the earth. Literally, when you read the Prose Edda, you will see actual excerpts saying that they live in rock. They live in mines. They live inside mountains. That there are people who have broke through the mountain and found whole dwarven communities there. So you see, this wasn't something that J.R.R. Tolkien in the early 20th century invented. It was something that was there for hundreds of years prior to that. I will show you something else too. It's going to be kind of an interesting reaction I'm going to get. I'm going to actually show you a small excerpt from the prose Edda. And in that, we're going to get what technically for most people who read it would be very boring entry. Some of you may have read the Iliad in school by Homer. And if you read the Iliad, Heather's nodding her head, you know that book 2 out of the 24 books is the book that you fall asleep on. It's called the Catalog of Ships. It's just a list of this ship and who was manning it, this ship and how many men were on it, this ship, and it's just this tedious list. The prose Edda has something very similar. It's got this very boring list of dwarf names. So I'm going to read to you some of the dwarf names because I think you'll find it interesting. Here's an excerpt from the poetic Edda, I should say, which actually predates the prose Edda, in a section called the Volupsa. It's a small section of it. Here in verse 10, it says, there was Motsignir, the mightiest maid of all the dwarves. Notice the first name highlighted. And Durin, next. Remember the founding dwarf that Tolkien had mentioned? Many a likeness of men they made, the dwarfs in the earth, as Durin said. Ni and Nithi, and then literally you get Northri, Southri, Austri, and Destri, literally north, south, east, and west. Notice some of the other names. Dwelin, Nar, Nayan, Dayan, Biffer, Bulfer, Bomber. Does those sound familiar? Those are some of the very same names you see Tolkien using in The Hobbit. And by the way, besides Thorin and Thror and Thrain, did anybody happen to notice this name? Gandalf. So isn't it interesting? You know Gandalf, for those that are familiar, to be this wise wizard, so to speak, who was kind of guiding them. But in actual dwarven lore, the name Gandalf was associated with a dwarf. Okay, or say Norse or Viking lore, I should say. And literally, when you look at these examples, you can understand why people like Tolkien would draw off of these motifs. Going back to some of those really good examples, I mentioned Brock before, a craftsman. If you know anything about the god Loki, he's generally like sometimes he's really, really evil in some stories, and sometimes he's just a jerk that no one wants him around because he annoys people. And he entered into a contest with Brock to see if Brock could make an axe in just one night. And they entered a contest, and in the process of it, Brock was so determined, as dwarves are so determined to win, that he actually did win, but he kind of got tricked out of his prize. And his prize would be to be able to cut off Loki's head. And Loki kind of worded the contest in just such a way that he could annoy Brock, lose the contest, and still walk away with it with his head and be able to make Brock mad. That's the kind of person Loki was. But our character Brock really fits the dwarf motif. Hard worker, hands in the dirt, excellent craftsperson. And both Norse mythology and Tolkien's writings agree on that characteristic. Here's something that's very different, though, and I think it's worth mentioning. This is not something that Tolkien does. And therefore, what comes out in later mythologies and video games and movies and whatnot, they don't draw off of it either, at least in my experience. From the Volsunga saga. The Volsunga saga is something that was written more like the middle of the 1200s. It's out of all the sources, it's the one that has the most continuity to it. So remember I mentioned the poetic Edda and the prose Edda. It's like, it's just discombobulated stories that don't match up. The Volsunga saga is a story about a family, the Volsungs, and the 12 generations of their existence. And it's from that you get things like the concept of the magic ring and a cursed pile of gold and things like, and you could see where Tolkien may have grabbed from that. But what he didn't take was a shape-shifting nature. There was literally a dwarf called Otter who had the ability to live as an otter during the day. And then he would shape back into a dwarf. Fafnir, who was mentioned in one of my earlier lectures, some of you got the chance to attend. I know, Eileen, you and your family were there for that. My mom was there and my aunt. You might remember Fafnir was a dragon. Well, not technically, he originally was a very greedy dwarf who transformed himself into a dragon just so he could guard this big treasure. So that's kind of where the differences come in. I should mention, since we are talking about Norse mythology and Viking lore, we get dwarves originally from them. And so it is with elves. So next time we get together, we're going to follow a very similar format, starting with Tolkien. We'll go back to the Vikings, but I will tell you where our lectures will diverge next week. This is a very straightforward lecture. It's very easy to tag a dwarf as a dwarf. I mean, here's this one exception of the shape-shifting stuff. But elves, very, very discombobulated. The amount of interpretations of elves, very tricky, even when you get back into Norse mythology. The dwarves seem to have something that's much more consistent over and over again. And as one student that I have, and this was a student right in Miss Otteson. Miss Otteson's here today with us, one of my great students from my last 2 semesters. One of your fellow students, Miss Otteson, Mr. McKinney, he was going to be here tonight too. He mentioned it bothers him when he looks at movies and video games and they give dwarves a Scottish accent, because really it should be more of reminiscent of the Norse or Nordic accent, because that's where they originate. And that's just his opinion. I've seen some Scottish versions of dwarves in some mythologies, and maybe you have too. Well, that brings us to something very, very important. And I want to bring us back to our table of contents, just to remind you that we did start off with Tolkien, and we mentioned that Tolkien introduces his dwarves to the scene in September, it's late September of 1937. Well, maybe some of you here had the opportunity to watch this movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Does anybody know what year this film was produced? You can cheat and go on the Disney Plus app right now and find out. Are you ready for it? Doug, you want to take a shot?
I'm going to guess 1937.
Yeah. Produced in 1937, did not actually get released until very early February of 1938. So I want you to stop and consider that what may very well be the 2 most influential pieces of media that have shaped our viewpoint of dwarves came about roughly 85 years ago, within 5 months of each other. So let's take a moment and look, more than a moment, and look at the triple history of this very important story, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And I call it a triple history because, as you know, the Disney Corporation and Walt Disney at that time in 1937 did not invent the story. It was originally written down, or I should say it was codified during the Napoleonic era, roughly 1812 to be exact, or I should be more exact, 1812, by the brothers Grimm. That's Wilhelm and Jakob Grimm. And if you know anything about those 2 brothers, they were ones that loved to study history, literature, folklore. They took on this Herculean task of traveling village by village, house by house, town by town, inn by inn, tavern by tavern throughout Germany in the early 1800s, and asking people about the stories and the folk tales that they grew up with, the fairy tales, the tales that their parents told them when they tucked them in at night. And that's where you get all these works like Cinderella and Briar Rose, AKA Sleeping Beauty, as I saw you mouth the words, Samantha, and you know, the Elf and the Shoemaker, and so many of these stories that were turned literally into Disney films, and among them are Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I call this a triple history because we have to keep in mind, going backwards, history number 1, the film that shaped us. And I'm sure there's not a person in this room that does not have notice of that film and the motifs that are there. Don't forget the second part of that history. It's adapted from the work of the brothers Grimm some 120 years earlier. And let's not forget the third part of that history. They were pulling from many different variations of stories. And they took those variations to codify them and make a codified story. So you have to think about what goes on in the story, what goes on in the movie. What does it say about our culture then, culture then and culture now, and how we perceive these things? Here's a couple of main differences between them. You may look at this opening scene. So I can name them. I'm sure you can name. If I ask someone, please tell me who this dwarf is right here who's yawning. It shouldn't be hard. Hopefully you're not yawning through my presentation. I've done that to people sometimes. My own mother has fallen asleep during one of my lectures, just so you know, and I'm an only child. Who's that guy yawning? I just saw Samantha Maldor. It's Sleepy. And you could go through, we know there's Doc, and here's a guy holding in a sneeze. There's Sneezy. I asked my Aunt Dolores, who's on with us now, I asked her last week, who was your favorite dwarf? And she said, absolutely Dopey. She loved him. He was innocent. He was kind. You asked me who my favorite dwarf was? Grumpy. I love Grumpy. I think he's hilarious, okay? What's different here is a couple major differences between the 1937-38 cartoon and the original story is that Walt Disney and the animators definitely gave all the individual dwarves an individual identity. They're named. They have very different clothing, different personalities. Their personalities are based on their name. When you read the original story, they're just collectively called the dwarves. There's no names. They are looked at in the collective. The other thing I think is interesting about their existence, and this is both in movie and in book, a little different from what we talked about before. Where do they live? Now, we said this in Germanic and in Norse or Viking mythology, and Tolkien ends up drawing on that. Dwarves are usually in a mountain or in a mine. But where, if it helps, you can cheat. I'm going to bring it up on screen. You can look. The answers are on the screen. Where do the dwarfs live? You can say it out loud in the story. So should I point in the background?
They live in a cottage.
They live in a cottage. That's right. They live in a cottage, and that's how they end up meeting Snow White. Snow White stumbles across the cottage and so forth. What I find is interesting about this is both stories, both the one that we see in the film and both the one that we see in the Grimm's fairy tales, deal with the injustice, of course, the injustice of the evil queen, who, by the way, don't forget, happens to be Snow White's stepmother. There's no shortage of evil stepmothers in the Grimm's fairy tales. So it tells you something about German culture, about when people got remarried. I'm almost wondering what their impression of stepmothers would be. But she wants to kill this stepdaughter because she's the fairest in all the land. The mirror keeps telling her that. And so she tells the huntsman, you go off, bring her into the woods, kill her, bring back her heart as proof. And the huntsman can't do it. He kills a boar instead, puts the heart of the boar in the box, tells the queen that it was, Snow White's heart. And in the Grimm's fairy tale, she actually cooks it and eats it. Okay, so again, those fairy tales, this is what you tell your kids when you tuck them in at night, back in the 1812 or so. Okay, in any event, what I find is interesting, and maybe you guys can help me with this. You know that 1937 cartoon was, of course, had music in it. Very common for a lot of the cartoons that Disney had done to have very well-known musical performances. If I said I'm not going to sing because I'm a terrible singer, and I know my mom's going to chime in. Those of you that know, we don't want my mom to sing. Samantha knows that, and Doug knows that. If I said, do you know the song that goes something like that, like this? Someday, what's the next line? Samantha, you just said it. Mona?
My prince will come.
Yeah, she said, someday my prince will come, right? She's singing that. Okay, how about this one? Snow White also sings, whistle while
You work.
you work. And then when you think, well, what did the dwarves sing? Would anyone like to share? What does the dwarves sing?
Hi-ho.
Very good. Hi-ho. But you want to know something interesting? And when I sat back about a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago and watched the film through again with my notebook out, kind of studying it, I was interested to know that song, Hi-Ho, which most people know, is not the first song that introduces the dwarves to the audience. It's not. There's another song that they sing. See, she's in the cottage and she knows that someone lives there. She thinks it's children because the beds are small. And when she goes to fall asleep, all of a sudden you see the camera pan and it goes inside a mine. And the dwarves are working with their pickaxes. I want you to take a look at the opening stanza of the song they sing. We, notice the collective, the plural pronoun. We dig, 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 dig. Where? In a mine? No, look at the possessive pronoun. In our mine. It's our mine. And you see it within moments of that song. There, each of those dwarves are grabbing sacks of gemstones and throwing it into their vault. It's their mine. How long do we work? The whole day through. So that work ethic, they're in the mine, they're working, they're close to the gemstones. There is a concept of greed that does come out in dwarven reference. You see in Tolkien's mythology, the elves are always accusing the dwarves of being greedy. Here, they're going after the gemstones, constantly mining things out of the gemstones. Here's what I find interesting. The second stanza now addresses that verb dig with the adverb to, the action of digging. To dig, 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 dig is what we like to do. Now you get to the personality of the dwarves. This is the introduction in 1937, 1930, or whenever you and I saw it for the first time in our lives. There is nobody on Zoom with us right now that is 85 years old. Everyone's lifespan on this meeting have fallen within the time that this piece of cinema has been in existence. And so that concept of these hardworking dwarves in the rock, in the stone, working hard, craftsmen, it's all there. Some of the differences that do come out, I find, when I look at the original story by the Brothers Grimm and the movie adaptation as well, is the dwarves in the movie they actually start off kind of scared. Do you remember when they first come back to the cottage at night after the long, hard day's work? And they see there's a light on in their cottage. And they get scared because someone's inside. The dwarves of Tolkien would not be scared, they'd be angry. Who's in our house? But see, they're frightened. Oh, who is it? A goblin? Is it a ghost? You know, what is it? And there's this hilarious scene where, of course, you know, they go in, they sneak in, and they kind of push Dopey to go find out what's going on. And Dopey doesn't want to do it, and so forth. But what else is different too is once they get to meet Snow White, the relationship between Snow White and the dwarves is, I'm going to say, it's very much almost like a mother to children. She kind of disciplines them. Look at your hands are all dirty. Look at the mess that you made that I had to clean up. Make sure to go wash. I'll cook dinner, but you have to wash. And there's this hilarious scene where they try to wash Grumpy. You know, he just doesn't want to do it. It's a really good scene if you want to watch it. But again, it's almost like, if it's not a mother to children relationship, it's at least what maybe a lot of little girls would have when they play house and they play like, these are my children. That is not the relationship, ladies and gentlemen, that you read about in Grimm's fairy tales. In Grimm's fairy tales, are you ready for this? Snow White is a 7-year-old girl. She's never an adult in the story. And when she finds the cottage, it's clean. And when the dwarves come and discover her, they say, stay here. We know the evil queen is out for you. Stay here. All you have to do is cook and clean, and we will protect you and take care of you. So that's a whole different concept. There, it's almost like the dwarves seem to represent some kind of protection in the very scary woods. Stop and think about German culture, ladies and gentlemen. At a time when Germany was mostly forested, to go off into the woods was a very dangerous place. And that's why I'm not surprised when I read that particular fairy tale and I compare it to the other fairy tales of the Grimm brothers, that there's often somebody or something that aids you. A lot of times it's animals, and she has a beautiful relationship with the animals. And in this case, the dwarves, who are her protectors. They warn her, never open the door for anyone. Now that kind of comes through a little bit in the film. They say, oh, if the evil queen comes, don't open the door, don't let her in. But in the story, original story, she shows up, the evil queen comes in 3 different disguises, one after the other, trying to trick her. And every time she tries to kill this 7-year-old girl, the dwarves come home and free her. And the last time, unfortunately, they didn't get there in time. What I love about the film, and I invite you, if you watch the film again, to please pay attention to this. There is a character development that takes place with the dwarves that doesn't happen in Grimm's fairy tales. The dwarves are always the dwarves. They're consistent. They're a force of nature. But when you get to the 1937 story, these 7 dwarves who start off a little selfish, very scared, when they get news given to them by the animals of the forest that Snow White's in trouble, she bit the apple. Grumpy, who's grumpy the whole film, jumps on a stag deer, stick in hand, and leads the charge. We gotta save Snow White. And they charge to the woods to get to the cabin in time. And by the time they get to the cottage, it's too late. She's bitten the apple. Now, one little side point. I'm trying to think, like, if my wife was in trouble, okay, and I had to rush home, you know, if my wife was on the floor unconscious, I would like to think my first action would be go to my wife, make sure she's okay, not chase the person who left the house, although that would be important too. Well, just, you know, the dwarves in this case are dwarves. They're very vengeful, and they don't go in the house. Grumpy gets to the front. He sees the wicked queen, still disguised in the old hag form, and she's running through the woods, and he looks back. There she goes, let's get her. And so they all go after her. And Snow White's laying on the floor of the cottage. But what brings almost, I'm going to admit this, brings almost tears to my eyes. Disney did such a great job with this. She goes to the woods, the evil queen. She starts climbing up a mountain pass. And all 7 of those dwarves are climbing that mountain pass after her. And you could see the animators did a great job. The expressions on their faces, completely serious, not just grumpy, but even dopey, maybe not looking angry, but looking very concerned. Their viewpoint, we are going to right this wrong. And even though she tries to kill them, she tries to roll a boulder on them, it doesn't work. They're chasing her down. And in the 1937 film, 38 film, she kind of gets, you know, this lightning strikes the mountain pass, she falls to her death, you know, story's over. That's not how she dies in the book, by the way. Samantha's shaking her head, no, it's a much more gruesome death. You should know the original tales have far more gruesome deaths than whatever you saw in a Disney fairy tale. If you'd like to know, I will read it for you, but only if it's on request. I have the works of Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm right here. Would you like to know how she dies? All right. Well, apparently, Snow White does get married to the king's son. Yes, she's 7, but she gets married to the king's son. Remember, this is something told to little girls before they go to bed. You know, royal weddings, the greatest ending. And because the evil queen is a queen, she has to go to a royal wedding. And then she shows up knowing that apparently there's a beautiful bride that it's more beautiful than me. Well, I got to see this. Well, she got so mad when she saw it was Snow White, that Snow White was alive. I'll read directly from the last paragraph. This is how the story ends. Then she railed and cursed and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. First, she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she felt she should have no peace until she went and saw the bride. And when she saw her, she knew her for Snow White and could not stir from the place for anger and terror. For they had ready, the people at the wedding, had ready red hot iron shoes in which she had to dance until she fell down dead. That's how the evil queen died in the original story. And by the way, that's the end. Okay, that's how it ends. Now go to sleep, my daughter. Dream. What are you going to dream about after that? What I find interesting is in the story, though, you do have this beautiful connection. When she's on the floor after biting the apple, the dwarves come back and they mourn 3 days for her, 3 days. And they just can't bring it upon themselves to bury her because she's so beautiful. So that's why as craftsmen, they make that beautiful glass coffin. so that she wouldn't be in the cold, dark ground and people could see her beauty. And it just so happens as they're walking, they kind of hit a bump and she kind of coughs out the apple. And next thing you know, she wakes up and lo and behold, here comes the king's son. Oh, that's a beautiful woman. They marry. Okay, that's kind of how, very different kind of ending in the 1937 film, but nonetheless a happy ending for Snow White. Just a real quick question. For those of you that love Grimm's fairy tales, how many of you might be familiar with another of Grimm's fairy tales, Snow White and Red Rose? Samantha's shaking her head, nodding her head, yes. That is another of Grimm's fairy tales that features a character named Snow White. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not the same Snow White. She is a little girl, but she's not the daughter of a king and stepdaughter of a queen. She is the daughter of a widow, and she has a sister called Red Rose, and they have a very good relationship with one another. Interestingly enough, there's another dwarf in that story that's very different than the 7 dwarfs that we talked about earlier. He's evil. He is a very nasty, evil dwarf. Apparently, one night when the 2 girls were in the cold winter, the mother said, "Go bolt the door of our cabin shut because we don't, any strangers coming in." And right then there's a knock on the cabin, and they hear a voice. It says, "Please, it's cold. Could you let me in?" They go to let the stranger in, and in pops a bear's head, big black bear, and they get scared. And the bear starts to talk. "No, don't be afraid. I'm a friendly bear. I'm just cold." And they let him in. The bear warms himself up, and they have kind of build a relationship over the next weeks and weeks of the winter, where they let the bear in, they play with the bear and whatnot. Well, later on, when they leave the cabin towards springtime, they happen to come upon a dwarf who's really angry. He's got his beard stuck in a tree, and they ask him what happened. He said, "Well, I was trying to split this tree because and it's very ornery, because I needed to build a fire for myself because it's cold out, So I put the wedge in, and the wedge bounced out, and my beard got stuck when the tree closed up. And what am I going to do? You got to help me." So the girls didn't know what to do. So Snow White takes out a pair of scissors from her pocket and cuts his beard. You should know, we mentioned it earlier. You said it in the characteristics. I wrote it down. A connection to their facial hair. They don't like their beards cut. So he curses, "Why did you cut my perfectly good beard?" "Well, we tried to save you." And in 2 other cases, they also free him from different dangers while he curses and swears at them in the most, unthankful manner, until finally at one point, they meet him a 3rd time, and he's just insulting them and whatnot. And guess who shows up but a bear? It's the same bear that they made friends with. And the bear goes up to him, and he's like, "No, don't eat me, Mr. Bear. I'm a dwarf. I don't taste good. You ready for this? You want to talk about a thankful dwarf? Eat those 2 little girls over there." And so, and with that, the bear takes his paw and in one swipe kills that dwarf. And immediately he changes back into a human, and he explains, "This is an evil dwarf who cursed me. And he cursed me and took my treasure. I am the son of the king." And with that, he marries Snow White, and then his younger brother marries Red Rose. And then you come right back to this whole royal wedding fantasy that kids have. But you see, it's a very different kind of dwarf. And there's actually reference in there to plural evil dwarves. So can you see, even in the Grimm's fairy tales, the dwarves are not always the good guy. And Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, definitely. They are a force of nature that's there to guide you, protect you, take care of you. Here, it's somebody that you don't want to mess with, and don't ever mess with their beards, and don't ever mess with their gold. All right. Now it's a good opportunity for us to sit back. We have to think back on our discussion. We looked at Tolkien's work in short. We thought about people like Gimli and his prejudice towards elves, how he had to overcome it, his love of the mine and underground, and his thoughtfulness towards the quest and his tenaciousness. You think about those dwarves in the book The Hobbit, who are going to go through hell, you might say, to have to get their homeland back at any cost, stay to the quest. You see almost a connection to nature again, with the dwarves, or dwarfs, you might say, in Norse mythology, the closeness to the ground, the craftsmanship. Now we have to go look at Rumpelstiltskin. This is our ending point for today, a little puzzle. All the story says, it's a very short, it's only about a 5-page story, ladies and gentlemen, and you can read it for yourself in just minutes. A little man visits the miller's daughter, and as you know, the poor miller's daughter is suckered into, because of her father's boasting, my daughter can spin straw into gold. Well, King says, let me see it. And threatens this young girl, you know, if you don't do it, I'll kill you tomorrow. Thanks, I don't know, but these Germans must have thought about their kings back then. But, you know, anyway, Doug will explain that later. It comes from German background. Anyway, so the you know, she doesn't know what to do, and poof, knock at the door. This little man comes in. The little man says, I can help you. What do you got to give to me? I'll give you my necklace. He spins the straw into gold. The king's impressed, gives her a bigger room of straw. Now she doesn't know what to do. Little man shows up again. What do you got for me? Oh, I got my ring. I'll give me the ring. I'll spin the gold. Spins the gold. Comes back the third day with a bigger room. She's got nothing left. Do you remember what he requested from her? I saw Samantha mention it. If you do end up marrying the king, I want your firstborn child. Now that is a really creepy and eerie thing when you put that in a child's tale. Some little man, and she's and literally later on in the story, she does marry the king, she does get pregnant, she does give birth to a child, and he shows up, he says, okay, where's the deal? And she's begging him, please, please, I'll give you all the gold we have. And he's like, there's not enough gold in this kingdom to replace my desire. I want something living. And you got, what is he going to do with this child? So my question to you, his only description about this is a little man that can spin straw into gold. Is Rumpelstiltskin a dwarf? How many might say he is, and how many might say he is not? Anyone say he is? He's a dwarf? The word dwarf is not used anywhere in the story. I just want you to know that. But fitting the characteristics, do you feel he fits it? Yes or no? I tend to be of that opinion that Samantha just said. Doug, what's your thought?
No.
Yeah, I tend to be of the
no.
opinion no. Don't you think you should come back next week to find out if he's an elf? Because we're gonna go through elves, and then we're Thank you. Do we have any final questions or comments today? Anything you think I left out that would be an interesting point?
No, it was very interesting.
I'm glad. I do want to just tell you, if you're interested, there is a book series that I've read. I know we're just about out of time at this point. But there's a book series that I've enjoyed here from the Warhammer universe that features a dwarf and his friend Felix. So it's Gotrek and Felix, and this dwarf is one of those who takes an oath, and because he's disgraced his family, and he is not going to die without getting his honor back. And there's, I don't know, about 13 books on these characters here. He epitomizes all the things we said about dwarves. Great craftsman, engineer, close to the ground, loves the mountains, hates elves, angry, loyal, and so forth. So think about what shaped you and your impression of dwarves. Tolkien, Grimm's fairy tales as put out yeah, I don't blame you, Andrew. I just say you like to replace your dwarf team. If you had dwarves, you're going to get a lot of work done. And so Grimm's fairy tales well play into that. Please, if you can, come back next week. We're going to follow a very similar format, looking at elves, but there'll be a little more variables and confusion, because you're going to find elves are not as straightforward, but they're no less fascinating. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Alex.